In this lesson, we're going to focus on solving multi-step linear equations. So solving multi-step equations is just like solving two-step equations. The whole concept behind it is that you need to understand that in order to solve that equation for the variable by itself, you need to ultimately undo the order of operations that's happening to the variable backwards. That is how we get the variable by itself. So here, looking at this original problem, one thing that I know that I need to put in here to remind myself is that if I see a big fraction like this, I know that there's imaginary parentheses built in around that numerator. So I need to put that in there so that I don't forget to account for that as I think through the order of operations. So here I'm going to write out the order of operations for the left-hand side because that's where my variable is. And if I knew the value for x, the first thing I would do is I would go inside of those parentheses and I would start by performing that multiplication of 5 with x. And once I had multiplied 5 and x, I would then keep in the parentheses and I would add the 35. And at that point, I would have the entire value of my numerator. And then from here, what I would do third is I would divide by 3. So there are 3 operations here on the left-hand side, and if I were to have a value for x, I would evaluate that by multiplying by 5, adding 35, and then dividing by 3. And remember, I'm going to now undo these operations in reverse in order to get the x value completely by itself. So I start here by dividing by 3, and the way to undo a division of 3 is to multiply both sides by 3. So to undo that division of 3, we're going to multiply both sides by 3. And as we do that, we undo that division, and we're left with 5x plus 35 on the left-hand side is equal to 60 on the right-hand side. And then we're going to focus on this plus 35 here. And the way to undo that plus 35 is to either add a negative 35 or subtract 35 from each side. And as we do that, what will happen is this will become 0, and we'll be left with 5x on the left, and then 60 plus negative 35 leaves us with a positive 25 on the right. And then my last step is I need to undo this multiplication of 5, so I divide both sides by 5 and end up with x is equal to 5. And then I could take this value and I could substitute it back into that original equation to check it. But remember, the whole concept of solving these multi-step equations is you need to know the order of operations of what's happening to x, and then you need to undo those order of operations backwards. So a second example here, and again, we always start by thinking through what is happening to x. If we knew the value for x, what would those order of operations be that would be applied to x? And I know that the order of operations tell me to start inside of the parentheses, and then inside of there I have the option to multiply or add. So if I knew the value for x, the first thing I would do is I would multiply x by 4. I would then stay in the parentheses and add 5. And then I would know the value inside of the parentheses, and lastly I would multiply by 3. So those are the operations that I need to undo in reverse. So then from here, in order to undo the multiplication of 3, I need to divide both sides by 3. So those are undone. I'm then left with 4x plus 5 is equal to a negative 3. I then need to undo the positive 5, which I can undo by adding a negative 5 or subtracting 5 from each side. So this becomes 0, and we're left with 4x is equal to negative 8. I then need to undo the multiplication of 4 by dividing both sides by 4. And I end up with x is equal to negative 2. All right, example 3 starts to get a little tricky. I want to do some things here to prevent myself from making any sign errors. So here I know that this top numerator is enclosed in parentheses. I also see a subtraction here, so I know that this is really a plus negative 1 times x. And I want to throw that in there so I don't make any errors and I don't miss that multiplication of negative 1. Now at this point, my equation is ready to be solved. So I'm going to start by thinking through the order of operations as they happen to x. So as I look at this equation here, if I knew the value for x, the first thing that I would do is I would multiply x by negative 1 because it's in the numerator in the parentheses, and between the addition and the multiplication comes first. Once I've multiplied x by negative 1, I would add 5 to it, and then lastly I would divide that entire numerator by 2. Now to solve this equation, I need to undo the order of operations in reverse. So I'm going to undo the division first by multiplying both sides by 2, so that undoes itself. On the right hand side we're left with negative 6. So here I have 5 plus negative 1 times x is equal to negative 6. Then I need to undo that positive 5, so I need to add a negative 5 to each side. As I do that, this zeroes out, and I'm left with negative 1x is equal to a negative 11. I then need to undo the multiplication of negative 1 by dividing both sides by a negative 1. And as a result, I'm left with x equals 11. All right, one final larger example before we move on to a different concept. Here we have a slightly larger problem. I can see a couple of things. I notice that I have parentheses here that I need to keep in mind. I also notice a subtraction, so I'm going to change that into plus a negative 9 using keep, change, change. All right, in order to solve this equation, I'm going to start by thinking through the order of operations as they happen to x on the left-hand side of this equation. So I would start inside of the parentheses, because that's the order of operations, the parentheses come first. And inside the parentheses, I still apply the order of operations, and I see two operations, a multiplication and an addition. So the first operation that I would do to x, if I knew the value for x, is I would multiply it by 6. I would then take that value multiplied by 6 and add a negative 9. That would then take care of the parentheses, and at this point, I would multiply whatever that value inside of the parentheses was by negative 3. And then to add the problem, I would add 5. So then from here, in order to solve the equation, we're going to undo the order of operations in reverse. So I'm going to undo that addition of 5 first by adding a negative 5 to each side of the equation. This leaves me with negative 3 times 6x plus negative 9 on the left-hand side and a positive 4 on the right-hand side. So then I move up and I need to undo that multiplication of negative 3, which I'm going to undo by dividing both sides by negative 3. So here I have 6x plus negative 9 is equal to 4 over negative 3. And then from here I need to undo that addition of negative 9, which I can undo by adding positive 9 to each side of the equation. So I have 6x is equal to 4 over negative 3 plus 9. And while this might look difficult, believe it or not, we have all of the skills we need to add those fractions together. So this is a negative 4 thirds plus, we can do 9 over 1, and we can turn that into thirds itself. So here we would have 27 over 3 would be that written in terms of thirds. So those added together, the negative 4 plus the 27 would become positive 23 over 3. So then from here we're back to this problem when we have 6x is equal to 23 over 3. We need to undo that multiplication of 6 by dividing both sides by 6. And again, this might seem like it's difficult, but really we have the fraction knowledge necessary to solve it. So we have x is equal to, and this is 23 over 3 divided by 6. And remember that can be written as 6 over 1. Then here we use keep, switch, flip. So we have 23 over 3 times 1 over 6. We multiply that out, and our x value ends up equaling 23 over 18. So while the answer is not great, we have all of the tools necessary to be able to solve this more complicated multi-step equation. The last thing I want to talk about is another strategy that we could use if the equation contains parentheses. You should be familiar with that concept called the distributive property. And so if your brain was suggesting to you that you distribute the 3 to both the 4x and the 5 to get 12x plus 15 is equal to negative 9, that would be an okay step too. So if you would rather distribute first and then from here apply your knowledge of the order of operations to x, for this particular problem we would take x and we would multiply it by 12 and then we would add 15 and then we would undo the order of operations in reverse, so subtract 15. So we'd have 12x is equal to negative 24. Divide by 12. We would find x equals negative 2. So if your gut instinct is to distribute first, that is a-okay. If it contains parentheses like that, you can utilize the distributive property to rewrite that problem in a different way, and then from there move forward with solving that multi-step equation.